soldiers may be allowed to open fire if lives put at risk by yellow vests. The yellow vest protests going on in Europe right now, which is pretty much on media blackout here in the United States. I bet you could ask any random American about the yellow vest movement, and they probably would have no idea what the hell you're talking about. But it's been going on for, I don't know, a couple months now. It's just straight protests and, like, you know, people getting hurt, things getting vandalized all over France and a couple other parts of Europe, but mostly France is where the intense stuff is happening. I actually spoke to somebody from Germany a couple weeks ago, and she was saying that, yeah, it's mostly in France, that at least in Germany, they don't have any of those protests going on in Germany. So, but I do expect this to continue spreading, and I think United States is ripe for this kind of protest movement. Just like Occupy Wall Street really took over the narrative a lot, or you know they you know got on the news and you know were everywhere. Like Occupy Tallahassee, like they were occupying everything, right? But the thing with Occupy Wall Street is that it was centered around communism, centered around socialism. It was really an anti-capitalist movement, and you know, so that's the thing. The Yellow Vest movement is more of a unified front. You've got leftists, you got rightists. You got people on the left, people on the right. You got moderate people coming together to protest the same thing. The policies of Macron, the globalist policies of Macron that, you know, benefit banks and corporations but don't benefit the people.
Another week, another protest, but this time opening fire at crowds is apparently an option.
The orders of the soldiers are strictly set out, extremely precise. They have different modes of action to face all threats. It could go as far as opening fire if their or someone else's life is at threat.
This Saturday, over 5,000 armed soldiers will be in the streets. Parisians are divided over the prospect, with some calling it catastrophic.
I think this is an extreme measure. Obviously, this will not solve everything, but at least it will help to avoid further destruction.
I don't think anything good will come of the government's decision to use the army.
As for what they did last Saturday, they burned down restaurants and so on. I think this is a necessary measure.
It's not the army's mission. It shows the failure of the government and the failure of our politicians.
I think if the army opens fire, it will prove that crisis management was not sufficient. I think that bringing in the army is a way of responding to the crisis, but it's not a solution to the problem.
Politicians from across the political spectrum have reacted with anger to this latest measure.
It's a serious mistake. Imagine them standing in front of the National Assembly or the Élysée Palace and hordes descend on them. What happens to them? Will they be fired on? Will people be killed?
In 2017, Emmanuel Macron promised to appease France. In 2019, he suggests that the military could shoot at demonstrators. Macronism is fracturing France and sending it into the abyss.
This time you have gone too far, Mr. Macron. You have to know how not to push the entire country into a settling of scores. It's time to return to more proportional methods. The whole world would be horrified to learn that here in France we are using the same methods that we condemn when they are used in other countries.
In addition to putting soldiers on the streets in order to prevent another wave of violence, the French president has decided to close several iconic landmarks, including this famous avenue, the Champs-Élysées. On Saturday, anyone protesting here will face a fine to up to 135 euros.
These announcements are not the result of powerlessness, but rather a public order response to this precise reality, a horde of hooligans.
Whoa, damn.
It seems beefing up security on the streets is the only solution to this crisis that Emmanuel Macron can see, and he's now turning his attention to other challenges.
Today, Brexit for me is not a technical negotiation, it is a political lesson before anything else. We have to acknowledge that China has been playing on our divisions. I believe that when anyone brings their domestic problems or divisions to the European Council, it is a waste of time, and I don't have time to waste.
The 19th weekend of protests is now here. The French capital is braced for a fresh outpouring of anger, and the protesters have adopted the slogan, "The war has been declared."
What an asshole. And how is he blaming China? I don't know, bro. You need to, like, explain that shit a little further, because I have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, I'm sure China's in there, got its fingers in there somewhere or another, but this is a direct response to his policies, and which they don't agree with. And it's funny that he's just calling them a horde, a mob. The way he's framing this really shows the intent, and can kind of foreshadows what might happen soon enough. As the story indicates, that soldiers may be allowed to open fire on the people. Like, if that really I mean, a lot of people think that France is already in a civil war at the moment. So, I mean, if they start opening fire, then you're going to have a serious problem. I don't think it's too out of the question to see Macron call for martial law at some point. Because, like I said, these protests have been going on for a while, for weeks and weeks. I think it's been a couple months now, and it's getting out of control. He doesn't have any control. They just continue every day, and I don't know how they do that. Like, how the hell, how these people can afford to protest every day? But I don't know. I guess the social welfare and stuff. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. And again, the mainstream American media doesn't talk about the Yellow Vest protests out in France. So here's some more. We've got from Wearechange.org, Luke Radowski's interviews this guy from France who was involved heavily with the protests, organizing the protests, and so this video gives some inside perspective. It is an anonymous source, but I mean, it sounds legit enough, I guess. Just keep a skeptical ear, I guess.
Movement began late last year when, of course, the mainstream media was not talking about it, and we were telling you this is something major. This is something that is going to continue on. This is something that's going to spur the European spring. And now, just after last week, after the 18th week of mass demonstrations, not just in Paris, all over France, we are seeing it go to one of its craziest, most insane points. To talk about this and a lot more, we have Bob. Bob is one of our official sources. He's anonymous because there's a lot of reprisals against the Yellow Vest movement because, again,
it's just kind of funny that they put this image up, Bob.
Speaks for. He does talk to a lot of organizers. Dude? He is there on the ground. He is there in Paris. He knows a lot of people, and he has a lot of on-the-ground information that has been very solid and very good, and of course gives you a perspective.
That would make a good
anywhere else. And
that would make a good Halloween costume, just like full body black spandex with a yellow vest on. Call yourself Bob.
Bob has been telling me has been absolutely fascinating because I don't know if you know this, Bob, but again, Bob's not your real name. It's just an anonymous name that we're saying here. I've been watching some Western TV, and again, the last thing that happened after this crazy, very violent, I think the most violent ever, 18th week protest, the mainstream media in America mentioned it for 2 minutes, maybe at max, and it was like, oh yeah, there's some French people protesting about fuel. And of course, I'm like, that's not even any of the story. And that's why I wanted to talk to you and get everything. Of course, this video is probably going to go longer than 10 minutes. The first part's going to be on our main channel. The longer part's going to be on our backup channel. But Bob, first of all, wow, the 18th week was really insane. Where is this movement right now? Because it's definitely not going away like many people want it to.
Yeah, there's been a militarization of the conflict, and it's going wilder right now. The Interior Ministry, what you could call the Homeland Security in the United States, the Interior Ministry is now calling for the deployment of the Sentinel, which is troops, military troops surrounding the next Yellow Vest protest. So it is now allowed through.
That guy there might have gotten hit by like a rubber bullet or something. They're using rubber bullets, a lot of tear gas. I can't imagine how many like gallons of tear gas they've used so far. Yeah, and just riot sticks. That's mostly what they've been using. Now they're talking about using live ammunition.
The urgency state laws that were enabled I think it was a couple of months ago because of the terrorist attacks, and these emergency laws enable the utilization of military personnel on the streets, which was supposedly to prevent terrorist attacks, but now they are going to be used for Yellow Vest protests. So the word
so is this
terrorist,
like martial law?
No, it's not martial law. But that's the tricky thing, you know. You don't have to, in France, because of these laws, you don't need martial law to bring these military personnel on the ground to protect certain institutions. That's what they say, but you know, you don't protect institutions with military personnel if it's a social demonstration or any demonstration that is coming from a social uproar in the country. So the word terrorist is now being used many times on TV shows, describing last Saturday's revolt on the Champs-Élysées. It's
so BMTV probably, not the CNN only of France, and all the other mainstream media outlets are saying, if you're if you're a part of the Yellow Vest movement, that's the media, I mean kind of the state media talking point, right? That they're terrorists?
No, we are not saying it's all the Yellow Vests, but because these 2,000 black blocs were there, and when we saw the images, you know, we have to defend the Republic, defend the state, and the integrity of our government. Whatever, they have their own rhetoric to say that it's a terrorist. They don't say terrorist attack, but they say it's a. I mean, they're sleeping. It's a war on semantics. They're saying terrorist is an attack on institutions that can cause death, but there were no death actually, and it's also. I mean, you could see the images. All this fire. Of course, no one is defending this, but it was only attacking buildings or shops or symbols like you know, this restaurant that is called I don't remember the name again now.
It's one of the most famous French restaurants there. There was also a building. There was allegedly a child and a mother trapped that were screaming in the fire that started from the bank. I mean, there's also been a huge discussion. And I want to bring this up because when I'm at the Yellow Vest movement, there's a big faction of people who are very peaceful, who are saying, stop attacking the police, who are there to mediate stuff. And then there's another element that it seems like the police are letting get away with more violent crime, and the police seem to be attacking those peaceful people more, which I wanted to bring up to you, because that's kind of my understanding of it. Am I right or am I wrong, and what's your take on this bigger violence?
I couldn't hear everything what you said, but I kind of understood that you were asking if there were a more peaceful protest in overall. I would say yes, because I mean, you don't become a violent person from you know, from one day to the other. It's not happening like this. The people who are really protesting with violence, they have done this, in the past. And there's a few elements of people who became violent because of the repression, the police that was using also a lot of these weapons like the flashball and so on. I mean, you can imagine 20 people lose
Yeah, the
their eyes.
flashball, which literally blinded about what is it now? Over 20 people now.
It's
There's
forbidden.
people
It's
without
forbidden
hands.
in all
Yeah,
other
yeah.
EU states. You can imagine. I mean, France is the only country where you can use these so-called semi-lethal weapons. I mean, how can it...
Yeah, less lethal, they call them here in America.
Right.
So it's like less likely to kill you. That's really what they're saying.
Well, it didn't kill, but it destroyed lives. And if you mutilate some persons because they were demonstrating for their rights, I mean, it's not anymore a semi-lethal weapon. It's a repression. It's a militarized repression. And these people usually didn't have their any weapon in their hands. Some of them probably I don't know, less than 10 people who were injured were actually violent, but the majority of them were not. I mean, 2,000 people were injured, and some of them really hard. On the other side, you have something which is also a form of violence, which is that 20 police officers took their own life since the beginning of this year, in 2019. If you want to have a comparison, there were only 36, I mean only, it's not a right word actually, but there were 36 people of them who took their life last year. So if you compare these two numbers, it's a crazy number for 2019. It's not directly because of this yellow vest protest, because many of the policemen are actually for this protest, but not the violent protest. But they have no means to do their work. They are being pressured on a daily basis. Sometimes they have to pee on the ground. I mean, they have to pee in their pants because they have no pause during the day. They have no protection.
Yeah, and if I could interrupt you, if I could interrupt.
Sounds like they need to equip them with diapers along with those, along with the live fire weapons.
I talked to some of the police officers, and they are way overworked.
Yeah, absolutely.
Extremely stressed out, and you could just see it on their faces because, again, every week, this is 19 weeks of huge protest everywhere, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, and then they have to guard that area. But one thing I wanted to bring up with you, because there always has been this kind of two different factions within the Yellow Vest movement. One is the violent, one is the non-violent.
So this has been going on for almost 5 months, these protests? That's insane.
And depending on what happens, sometimes the police, usually the police, from what I have seen, start the problems, start the aggression, start the violence.
Well,
from everything I've seen, personally, myself. And you have to ask yourself, is there something to when peaceful protesters are being attacked and the violent protesters are being let go and pretty much allowed to do what they want? Because that's what some people are saying is happening, that the police are mainly attacking peaceful protesters, but when it comes to the violent elements, they want those to happen since they make people not like the Yellow Vest. There's even police officers running around with hammers, which is absolutely terrifying. What's your take on it, and where's the dichotomy between the violent and the non-violent factions now, because it sways so much within the Yellow Vest movement?
Well, first of all, it's very convenient for the government in place to have images of such violent uproar in the streets, because they think it can change the majority's opinion. They think it can bend the reality towards their own control on the policies. But in overall, it's a very tricky question, because you have to understand that some policemen can actually lose their, can explode, and just through the pressure can be very violent. But some of them actually were fighting. There was an infighting in the police. You have another image which is very interesting.
Okay, so we're going to cut it there for this discussion just on this channel. The conversation will, of course, continue on our backup channel.
All right, so I definitely recommend you watch the second part to that. So a lot of interesting, insight to what's going on there. We definitely are hearing from this video the impact that the protests are having on the police themselves. Yeah, I can just imagine like 5 months of straight protests, having to work just about every day, probably working long hours, getting spit on, getting shit thrown at you, and having to control a bunch of people who you, for the most part, agree with. Yeah, that that makes sense. That makes sense why you'd be stressed out. Well, the police, they need to work with the Yellow Vest movement and remove Macron from power. They need to have an uprising over the government, is what I think. Because if they're not happy with their government, if most of the people, it seems, are not happy with their government, then that needs to change. Because it's not just one political faction that's become radicalized. It's a bunch of people who just got fed up. There comes a point where it's more radical to continue accepting the tyranny, continuing to accept being taxed out of existence, continuing to be having your rights taken away. It's more radical to allow that to happen than to actually step up and do something about it.